Melanie Sage, and I work in Amherst Alumni and Parent Programs Office. I'm here today to introduce you to Tom Dumm, Professor of Political Science, and for the past 2 years, Chair of that department here at Amherst. Tom has in the past taught courses in American politics, especially on the presidency, and American political culture, and in recent years has focused more on teaching in the area of contemporary political theory, his main area of scholarly interest. He nonetheless taught the American presidency this past fall to a class of 140 students. Tom is the author of 5 books, most recently, Loneliness as a Way of Life, which was published last fall by Harvard University Press, and about which one critic stated the following: through subtle and provocative readings of Shakespeare, Melville, Arendt, and other thinkers, Dumm finds terms for acknowledging and inhabiting his own loneliness, and perhaps ours as well. His calm yet insistently disarming voice claims and challenges us, even when we resist it. Tom has recently co-edited with his colleagues Corrine Bassler in sociology and Austin Serrett in political science and law, jurisprudence, and social thought, an edited volume with UMass Press titled Performing Violence, which is forthcoming next year. He is also the founding editor of Theory and Event, an international journey of contemporary theory, which recently celebrated its 10th anniversary. He serves as nonfiction editor for the Massachusetts Review, and recently interviewed Cornel West for that publication's 50th anniversary issue. In 2001, he was named a Guggenheim Fellow. His current research is on the idea of home in political thought. Tom lives here in Amherst. His daughter Irene is a rising junior at Wesleyan University, where she is double majoring in sociology and Latin American studies. She has done work with Native American tribes in the rainforests of Ecuador and is interested in issues of gender equity in tribal families. Tom's son Jimmy is a rising junior at Amherst Regional High School and a varsity soccer player. Maybe someday at Amherst. Today, Tom will share his thoughts on the early days of the Obama administration. Welcome, everyone.
Thanks. That sounds real important. Yeah. Let's see. I'm really glad to be here. I very much like interacting with alums. I've been doing a bit of it this year. I was out in San Francisco before the election, and then to Atlanta, and then to Washington. And I find that what is the best part of all of it is talking. So I'll try to be provocative for a while, so that you people in the class of 54 can scream at me at the end. Well, 59, I'm sorry. 49. Yeah, I think we have 5-year increments here. So what I'll do is I'll talk a little bit about this. Now, the premise of my talk had to do with the idea of American renewal. I was sort of asked if I would contribute to a blog that the SSRC does on this topic, and I ended up declining to do it, but I was haunted by the premise of it, which has to do with this idea that somehow there's a kind of American exceptionalism that doesn't inhabit the rhetoric of our presidents, and whether or not Obama has captured that, whether he's transforming it, whether he's trying to change it. So I'm basically going to throw out a few provocative barbs concerning that, and hopefully provocative. I don't know, maybe they're dull to you. So let's go. Back in 2008, seems so long ago, I talked to alum in San Francisco and Atlanta and Washington, and basically made a couple of claims. First, I spoke about theories of American presidencies, what I was teaching at the time, leaning a lot on the work of a Yale professor named Stephen Skronik, who claimed that presidencies exist in 2 simultaneous time frames. A cyclical time frame, which adheres to the cycles of party power. Most of us are familiar with that, right? They talk about the political cycles and transformative elections. For instance, the New Deal comes in with FDR, and the Republicans are vanquished, and the Republicans come in with Reagan and the Reagan Revolution, and the Democrats are vanquished for a while. So there does seem to be a persistent cycle in terms of elections, where one party rises to dominance, consolidates its power, enacts its program, maybe reinforces it, but eventually they weary, and then the other party takes over. This is sort of a staple of American politics. But Skronik talked about another kind of time, what he called secular time. And that is history, one damn thing after another. And indeed, in the case of the United States, our growth from being a small country on the edge of a continent to becoming a superpower. And what is entailed in that, especially in terms of the governmental apparatus. That is to say, how much more constrained our national political actors are because they get hemmed in by these huge institutions of power. It's a paradox of power. The state grows, and our ability to maneuver and to be flexible declines. So I talked about that and talked about the extraordinary growth of government, the immense web of laws and regulations, and the creation of a very large permanent government, as well as a military-industrial complex and all the accoutrements that occur whenever you become a global superpower. Right. This development, coupled with an increasingly polarized political climate that has in part been brought about by that very growth, and that has been exacerbated by the emergence of new forms of electronic media in recent decades, has increasingly diminished the ability, this is the argument, of presidents over this secular time to fundamentally shift the direction of government when they come into office. Whether they want to or not, whether they have a big mandate from the people or not, it's become harder and harder over the course of the last century. So what Skronik argues is that we are now in a period where we're going to have a series of disjunctive presidents, what he calls people who will come in with every intent of transforming things, and within a year, everything will be back in its old morass. Presidents who have come to office not with the ability to do anything other than repudiate the previous regime, without being able to initiate the needed changes. Theodore Lowy, who was a teacher of both Skronik and I at Cornell long ago, has argued in a book called The Personal Presidency that there's now a sort of a de facto law in place that's concerning presidential power, that presidents must act immediately upon taking office in order to fulfill their campaign pledges while they have a window of opportunity and personal popularity. And that over the past century, that window of opportunity has grown more and more and more narrow. Even as to get elected, they've had to promise more and more. So there's this real paradox of presidential power at work. Okay. In a certain sense, presidents become helpless giants, buffeted by forces beyond their control, unable to respond to increasingly deep crises brought about in part by the very success of the country in becoming what it is. We're kind of like this big, overblown, helpless giant of a country. The question then, when we imagined Obama being elected, was how much time would he have to enact his agenda? That is, given the depth of our problems, what would he be able to do? How much patience would the American people have? How much support would he be able to garner in Congress, especially during his first year? Right? Okay. Now, those two questions are a little bit different because support of the people and support of Congress, it turns out, are two drastically different things. Right? The gap between the desires of the public and those of Congress have rarely been larger than they are right now. In wanting to revisit this question today, I've invoked the idea of American exceptionalism, a claim that we're possessed by a set of distinctive values that in times of crisis come to the fore, and in a sense save our sorry behinds. Presidents are compelled to use the language of exceptionalism in two important ways. Right? Well, first of all, they wouldn't be president if they didn't have an abiding faith and belief in the United States as a very special place. Right? If our presidents are to be believed, we are always doing something new and something great. Listen to this. We've had, in the past 80 years, the New Deal, the Fair Deal, the New Frontier, the Great Society, the New Nixon, Morning in America, 1,000 Points of Light, a new covenant, a bridge to tomorrow, and compassionate conservatism. These are wonderful things. What's the slogan of the Obama administration? They're branding it right now. Anyone know? Yeah.
New foundation?
The new foundation. It's new. It's a foundation. How they're going to suspend the House while they slip it under, that's our question. Right. Okay. Do it all the time. These slogans are made to do a lot of work, and that they suggest another word that has become the brand of the Obama campaign last year, and that is change. Right? I mean, he managed to monopolize it. So, but the rhetoric of dynamism, newness, transformation versus negativism, Remember the phrase nattering nabobs of negativism? Yeah, William Safire for Spiro Agnew, that distinguished vice president. This means that it simply works in both ways, right? Okay, the people who opposed Nixon were negative, right? The people who oppose Obama, all they can do is say no, right? Okay, so it has a certain kind of force. What is interesting about this is that it reflects that it reflects this fact. While it's common for us to claim that there is no real progressivism in the United States anymore, the truth is that all ruling parties for the past 80 years, whether they're Democratic or Republican, or if you will, Democrat and Publican, since we're starting to do that these days, have had to envelope themselves in a rhetoric of progressive change, transformation, in order to be credible with the American people who are deeply addicted to this idea of American exceptionalism. All right. At the same time, and indeed as part of the rhetoric presidents have been compelled to use, they constantly invoke the Constitution. This is part two. The Constitution is the rock upon which this Church of America is built. Right? It's our secular religion, as indeed Abraham Lincoln famously said in his Springfield speech in 1835. Right? The Constitution, whether you believe it to be a living document, Justice Breyer, or a dead one, Justice Scalia, is the ultimate foundation. Well, that's what he says. He says it's dead. Is the ultimate foundation upon which all renewal is supposed to take place. No one can question it, especially the core of it, though many are incredibly inventive in interpreting it. Right? Especially relevant these days is the way we interpret the extent and limits of presidential power, but I'm getting a little ahead of myself here. Okay, so what does all this discussion of the rhetoric of exceptionalism and newness and greatness and constitution worship have to do with the early days of the Obama administration? I want to make several observations, and then we can open this up and have a conversation. First, in terms of the length of the window of opportunity, Obama has been remarkably successful at both enacting key parts of his agenda early on while sustaining a continued high level of popularity with the American people. His presidency effectively began before he was inaugurated, given the collapse of the Bush administration in the interim between the election and inauguration. But the enactment of the stimulus package, the successful extension of TARP monies, the credit reform, and the beginnings of the health program in terms of the legislation have all created a sense of momentum that has so far in some ways served his administration fairly well. Many of the Obama administration initiatives in foreign policy have also been embraced by the public. I find it astonishing, for instance, that the outreach to Cuba has generated almost no controversy in the public after that being such a huge, huge issue for so long. I found it quite interesting. Okay. Now, partly these successes are due to the weak condition of the GOP in Congress and in terms of their national leadership, but it's also a testimony to the political skills of Obama and Rahm Emanuel especially. Now, whether this will be sustained for much longer is not clear, and it seems as though the great gains made by the Democrats in 2008, if they are followed by more gains, those gains will be much more marginal in 2010, simply given the numbers and given the demographics and the lack of contest in congressional districts. In the Senate especially, given the ongoing use of the non-filibuster filibuster, I wish someday they would have a real one, which they pull out the cots and, and go to the, go to having to, how should we put this politely, not leave the podium, but instead make use of their water bottles. Some things are guaranteed not to get done. A key part of health care reform, for instance, is being opposed by Senator Nelson of Nebraska. Conservative Democrats who oppose not simply to single-payer public insurance, won't even put it on the table, but to a public alternative to private insurance at all, the public option, which the Obama team says is key to any reform that we can have. Right? But these are matters of all sorts of inside the Congress and the Senate maneuverings. Here's what I want to think the real crisis of the Obama administration is going to be, and perhaps is already facing. And it leads me back to where we began about the secular constraints placed on contemporary presidents. I want to suggest two things that should upset everybody. First, Obama is little different than George Bush in two arenas of power that matter the most: economic policy and national security policy. And second, that the fault may be with them, but it is also with the state of constitutional governance in this age of American empire. Those are the two things. Let me stipulate, all right, just to lay out my bleeding heart liberal credentials on the floor for all of you. I think the offenses against the Constitution and so many of the actions taken in the Bush administration were outrageous, and indeed I would judge them to warrant criminal trials, especially the actions of Vice President Cheney, Secretary of Defense Donald Rumsfeld, Attorney General Gonzalez, Director of the CIA Tenet, and Secretaries of State Colin Powell and Condoleezza Rice, who for some reason have escaped an awful lot of criticism, but who were involved as well. And, of course, there are many underlings. Indeed, I was very unhappy this past autumn to have my students read memorandums internal to the Bush administration that authorized torture, and then have them read the results of that torture in terms of the implementation of policy. I never thought that this is something that was part of my brief in teaching the American presidency before, but you always have something new to upset you. Furthermore, as someone who's paranoid enough to think that my older brother, who along with other leaders of NGOs who opposed in court some of the gag orders imposed by USAID under the Bush administration, because he did that, he was undoubtedly bugged by those buggers, which meant that I was too. Since we speak several times a week on the phone, I found that violation of law to be very redolent of the Nixon administration. But I also find it telling that President Obama is trying to prevent serious investigation of these alleged crimes. And I find it equally telling that he is trying to figure out a way to evade the constitutional requirement of habeas corpus by suggesting that the indefinite detention of some prisoners, some of who cannot go on trial because the evidence was tainted as a result of torturous interrogation, by the way, may need to continue to be our policy, despite the fact that it is in direct violation of the Constitution. Moreover, I've also noticed that we now have members of the Obama administration suggesting that we may need to continue our occupation in Iraq for up to 10 more years, and that we need to build a green zone like the American embassy that currently exists in Baghdad in Kabul. While couched in much softer rhetoric and with much more diplomatic approaches to the Arab world than its fundamentalist Christian predecessor, President Obama, nonetheless, as David Brooks of the New York Times, hardly a liberal, has noted, has not separated himself from President Bush's policy, especially Bush's second-term policy, when it became clear that, as they say, the jig was up and the cover-up of all these policies had to be coupled with the dismantling of the worst abuses. On the domestic side of the ledger, while the nomination of Sonia, not Maria, as Governor Huckabee would have it, Sotomayor to the Supreme Court signals a mild willingness to begin to think about new constraints against corporate abuse of power. She's been known to be strong on antitrust matters. The larger frame, again, indicates as much continuity with the Bush administration as departure. Banks too big to fail, cooperation with health insurance giants, a TARP fund that gives to the rich and steals from the rest of us. Well, my populist standard can get the worst of me at times. Right? But I did not come to condemn Obama, only to point out, to quote George Clooney from the Coen Brothers movie, Oh Brother, Where Art Thou? Hey, boys, we're in a tight spot. Right? Okay. We're in a tight spot. Why? Why is it that there are these key continuities and crucial areas of policy, some of which Obama vehemently opposed when he was running for president? He is supposedly constrained by the Constitution, compelled, if he is to obey the law himself, to dismantle these illegal security policies. And while the rape of the Treasury, I loved learning the term moral hazard last fall during the free fall, may not be unconstitutional or even necessarily illegal, it does go hand in hand with the need to prop up a financial system that is almost completely beyond the control of a supposedly democratic state. Here's the thing. Since World War II, every president has violated the Constitution in matters consequential enough to result if one were to be a stickler in impeachment. Let me just go through it quickly. Truman seized the steel mills. Eisenhower secretly threatened nuclear war against the Chinese and planned the Bay of Pigs. JFK executed the Bay of Pigs, ordered assassinations, and committed other illegal crimes in terms of American foreign policy. Africa is one of the shameful incidents. LBJ, Gulf of Tonkin, assorted lies and blackmail against opponents. Nixon, Ford. Well, I still suspect that there was a quid pro quo pardon, but even if not, it was a disaster for the rule of law that President Nixon was pardoned, as we have seen in terms of the coming back of some of the same characters in the Bush administration. Right? Okay. Carter, secret funding for the Afghan freedom fighters. Thanks a lot, Jimmy Carter, for encouraging the creation of what eventually became the Taliban. Right? Reagan, Iran-Contra at least. Clinton, overstepping Congress and going to war in the Balkans. Bush, well, you've been there with that. For me, it's ironic that probably the least egregious offender in that list in terms of offenses against the Constitution was Bill Clinton, who was the only one actually impeached and put on trial, and then for allegedly lying under oath about, sometimes it's a tawdry thing teaching the American presidency. Kind of fun. Notice these offenses are all connected to foreign policy. But they are also connected with the politics of first the Cold War and then the politics of globalization. In all cases, presidents felt frustrated either by statutory constraints, or the slowness of Congress to approve, or by the need to wave bloody flags in order to get Congress to move. So what am I suggesting? Okay. Again, to go back, we believe in the Constitution, and we believe in the special fate of America. But we've not necessarily been well served by either belief in the past half century. Oh, everyone says Watergate showed that the system worked. Watergate was just one of the opening acts in terms of the system we now have. Obama, I want to argue, if he is to be the great president his ardent supporters want him to be, may well need to imitate another great leader from the century just past. Now, who am I thinking of versus who you might be thinking of? My great leader of the last century. Who should Obama imitate? What great leader? Well, Lincoln's 19th. Everyone wants to imitate Lincoln. That's who Obama wants to imitate. FDR, no, nope. Not Calvin Coolidge, not Truman. You guys are you're not even warm, guys. You're not even close. Not an American. No, not that drunkard, Jesus. No, I'm referring to Mikhail Gorbachev. Mikhail Gorbachev, the last leader of the Soviet Union who spoke the truth and led the Russian people past a system of government that no longer could be imagined to serve them anymore. See, I told you I'd throw a bomb at. Too expensive, that government was. Too corrupt, falling down from its own weight. Bankrupt financially, foolishly nationalistic, morally bankrupt toward the end. Well, throughout. That country was the most dangerous country in the world at the time, as much because of its delusions as because of the destructive power it controlled. American renewal in the Obama years may involve a new rhetoric of unity, may involve a resolve to rebuild, and may involve a resolve to secure the United States against the terror that lurks. But, and this is a big but, if we don't learn to live more humble lives in diminished circumstances and replace our foolish dreams of a return to the American century just past, we'll suffer a lot more than we will if we do not speak the truth to ourselves about the damage we've done. Permanent damage. The obsolete character of our current governing institutions, including the Constitution, and the failure of democracy that we have suffered in order to acquire this strange empire we're now losing. Right? In other words, right, to be most provocative, the Constitution doesn't work anymore. I don't know if you've noticed. Right? We have a Congress that is persistently corrupt, right? Okay. In which anyone can be bought. Right? We have a presidency that is stymied by that Congress, unless it participates in the bribery as well. Right? We have currently a junior senator from Illinois. When they release the tapes of him establishing a quid pro quo, and he goes before the cameras and he says, "This proves that I'm innocent." And you go, you say to yourself, how corrupt are we going to get? How far down this road are we going to go? And what I'm saying is that, we're We are a huge, rich, still powerful nation, but it's quite clear that we are not exempt from the laws of history. And there are soft landings in terms of being the dominant power in the world, and there are hard landings. And the way you get a softer landing is by speaking the truth. So if President Obama wants to help us renew the country, he can start saying that the old idea of us being a shining city on the hill has got to give way to something else. Got to give way to something a lot more humble. And that we have an awful lot of work to do, even to just stay where we are. All right. That ought to do it. All right. Yeah, James.
Professor Dumm, Jim Coombs, class of '89. First, a lot of questions came up in my mind, but most prevalent. Gorbachev unleashed forces which were the end of him, were the end of the system, and he was completely outstripped by them, such that he was not only imprisoned, but also regretful of the doing so. I don't know what he thinks now. I know that Professor Taubman's doing a book on him, but at any rate, this is a prophecy or a hope. Where then? I mean, what I see is this, having been in Grand Junction, shaking his hand with my family at the turning point of the election that Monday morning when John McCain said, the fundamentals of the economy are strong.
Yeah.
What is your prophecy and hope of him then doing so? What is the impact on the system? Does the 4-year presidency end?
Yeah. Well, here's the deal. I mean, we're not the Soviet Union, right? We've had, at worst, we suffer from a form of what political theorist Sheldon Wolin calls inverted totalitarianism. That is to say, we enjoy an enormous amount of personal freedom in this country. We have free and open elections, but the free and open elections seem not to matter as much as they used to, right? Okay. For the longest time, the large majority of Americans have supported some rational gun control. What did we just do in order to get credit card reform through Congress, a bill that the president signed? We're now allowed to carry revolvers in our national parks.
They voted.
They voted. They voted. Right. Now, did the majority of the American people want that to happen? No. Got attached as a rider by a clever senator from Oklahoma, Senator Coburn. Right? Okay, there's an example of a problem. Right? Now, the truth of the matter is that we still have we still have a free press. The newspapers are dying, but that does not mean that we don't have the freedom to express ourselves. The difficulty is that an awful lot of it is turned into entertainment. Right? So that last week, right, for instance, that was a pretty monumental bill despite the flaw in it, the credit card reform. Right? Well, what was all the headlines about? Two guys giving speeches across town from each other. Dick Cheney talking, having a debate with President Obama. And there was no debate. There was no real exchange. And that was even more elevated than most of this stuff. Right? Because most of the time we go to YouTube and we take a look at some of the extreme craziness that people are saying. So there's a sideshow going on. Right? Now, what would the prophecy be? Well, yes, Gorbachev did it, and Gorbachev suffered for it. Yeah, he was a political martyr, all right. He didn't spend that much time ago. But and he certainly is an honored person in terms of European society, if not in Russia at this point. But the truth of the matter is that there is a certain point at which we have to finally have major revisions at the national level of how the Constitution is going to operate. We've done it without having constitutional conventions before. Right? Bruce Ackerman, legal theorist and professor at Yale Law School, he wrote a multi-volume book called We the People, in which he talked about transformative moments in American constitutional history, in which we basically reinterpreted the Constitution to allow the change that needed to occur. Right? But see, every time we've done that in the past, it has happened in terms of the people enacting it. What French philosopher Rancière calls a constitutive moment occurred. where the
So
people...
what was the vehicle for that? Was it a public referendum?
No, the vehicle for those things were events, and usually you can only tell in retrospect. Civil War, right? The amendments to the Constitution and the Civil War. The non-amendments to the Constitution, but nonetheless the establishment of both the regulatory and public welfare apparatus of the New Deal that was declared constitutional because of all the overwhelming momentum behind it. Right? The Civil Rights Revolution of the 1950s and 60s and into even the 21st century that enabled certain things to occur. So it could look like that. Right? The difficulty is that right now there does not seem to be a clear way to do that, to change that. And it would seem to me that the only person who is elected by everyone in this country is the President of the United States. That's where so much of his legitimating power comes from, right? Which is one of the reasons why it was so unfortunate what happened in the year 2000, right? Because we did not really elect that president, right? Right? It didn't feel like he was elected, even if the legal niceties, it turned out in the end, were taken care of, right? Okay. Right? There's something at this anachronism called the Electoral College. Right? Again, part of our constitutional heritage. So this is the trick of this. Right? Now, do I really think that we're in a tight spot? I think we're in a real tight spot. Right? And part of the argument for not going far would be to say, we're not in as tight a spot as you think we are, Professor Dumm. Right? We're, the proportion of our national debt versus our gross domestic product, et cetera, doesn't look quite as terrible as all that. But I don't know. I'm not an economist. I don't even play one on TV. But I do read Krugman. Yeah.
My son and I have had this discussion, and one thing I've thought is that has Obama biding his time? We live in Syracuse, and there used to be an awful lot of pro-Obama letters. Now there's these letters on the other side that it's unbelievable reading them.
On the other side, on the right or
on
the left?
Right.
Yeah.
The growth of the Ku Klux Klan and the appearance of the South really did win the Civil War for the last 100 years. Is Obama laying low a little bit to consolidate a base so that he might then have more than just his first couple hundred days to enact legislation without the people who are afraid of him, the Dick Cheneys and all of those coming out of the woodwork and the numbers that they're coming?
Yeah, actually, when you're talking, whenever you say that, I hear an awful lot of Obama supporters thinking about the incredible sophistication and shrewdness of these subtle maneuvers where he's not doing this, but he might be doing that. And what I always think of is, I had my dissertation advisor in graduate school was a cynical man named Ben Ginsberg. And whenever people would start talking that way, he would say, you know what Wellington once said about Napoleon? He said, you can do everything with a bayonet except sit on it. Right? Okay. In other words, presidential power inherently has to be action. Right? You have to act. You cannot bide your time. Right? I think one of the things that they've been smart about in the White House is by pushing on all fronts at once. In the face of the conventional wisdom that had said for the longest time that you have to focus on one big thing at once. Well, I think they've been shrewd, and I think they've been smart, and I think they're doing really probably in terms of implementation as well as any new administration has. I think, period, in my lifetime, at least, because they hit the ground running even before the election. Now, of course, notice they've been impeded in certain areas, right? An awful lot of their appointments have not gone through because there are holds on them by different senators, right? Again, the arcane rules of the Senate. This isn't even the Constitution at work. These are the rules of the Senate that allow people to slow things down, right? Okay, I would take odds that that this new Associate Justice will not be sitting on the Supreme Court until at least after Labor Day. Right? I would take odds on it, and I would even venture a small wager on whether she will be sitting on the Supreme Court whenever the Supreme Court comes into session on the first what is it, first Monday of October, Tuesday of October, yeah. So because of this foot dragging, right? So I don't see it as a strategy. I think they're moving as fast as they can. Yes.
In retrospect, would you say that there are more roadblocks and more divisions and more divisiveness now in the last, let's say, 8-10 years than there have been collectively in the past 50, 100 years, or has it always been the same?
Strong partisanship has been more the rule than the exception in American politics. One of the reasons why the past 30 years or so has looked so nasty is because, well, the last 40 years has looked so nasty is because it was preceded by a period in which there really was a certain kind of bipartisanship for a while, right? I mean, you know, even up to Nixon was saying we are all Keynesians now, right? And indeed, if you look at the domestic policy of Nixon, everyone's heard this before, but it's true, right? His domestic policy was much more progressive than, say, anything that Bill Clinton ever came up with, right? Okay. So the illusion that we are in a more vicious period now, I'm not sure of that. I'm not sure of that. One of the things that exacerbates real tension and real nastiness is whenever the two parties are very close together and evenly matched. Remember, we were just talking blue states, red states a couple years ago. Well, if you look at it now, it'll take a while for the Republicans to figure this out, but they can't do what, for instance, Newt Gingrich did yesterday, right? Accusing the nominee of being a racist. Can't do that. Okay? He might have been able to do that, while Clinton was president, but it ain't going to wash now. And why isn't it going to wash? Because the base is just way too small now. And they will eventually figure this out, and the rhetoric will modify, right, on their side. And when the rhetoric on their side modifies, the rhetoric on the Democratic side will modify some. But the difficulty here is not partisan, right? That is what I was trying to emphasize. The difficulty here is in terms of us being, in certain ways, a helpless giant, right? Okay. There's not transparency in terms of the exercise of power at the national level, in part because you have to do, in some cases, the right thing in secret. Because doing the right thing is sometimes not legal. And that's part of where we're constrained. Now, see, this is why it's a nasty thesis, right? Please, argue with me. This is all too nice, right? The other side of the question is, of course, where are our constitutional values at this point? Yes, sir.
I may have missed it, but what kind of right, non-legal things are you referring to that have happened?
Let's see. I actually, reluctantly supported the idea of Bill Clinton engaging in the country formerly known as Yugoslavia, despite the fact that he had absolutely no permission, in fact, opposition from the Congress of the United States. And what he did, in terms of what he did, was he did, in fact, act quite illegally, right? I think that a case could be made. I wouldn't make it because I disagreed with it. A case could be made for the first Iraq War, in which operate, and an awful lot of that turns out was not based on legality, even though we got a resolution from the Senate to engage in it. So there are occasionally things like that need to be done. Sometimes secret initiatives in terms of diplomacy that are not supported by law or statute are undertaken. Indeed, so these are the sorts of things that occur. But see, what happens is that when that goes on, then some of the larger crimes are enabled as well, right? And that's the trick. You need transparency, but you also need to have the ability to enact policy, and it's a tricky balance between the two. So yeah. So I can't. Yes, ma'am.
I was just wondering if another ingredient here as to how things go under any presidency or whatever is or is not explicit in the Constitution has to do not so much with what kind of a political system we have, whether it was socialist or capitalist, whatever, but to do with how ethical, how many people in the society want to do something good and fair and not just be mean or not be unjust or not be blindsided to bad stuff. So, I mean, I think that's another thing that comes in waves as to how much crime there is that is really disgusting and how many, and often at the same time, wonderful movements happen for justice. So I think that's another whole operative.
Yeah, the question of where and how we learn our civic education isn't I would say in response divorced from these other elements, from our political economy or from the way our institutions are operating, right? So for just at the macro level, right? Our schools are grossly underfunded, right? Grossly, right? We're having a minor crisis, comparatively speaking, here in the town of Amherst, right? Because property values are not sustaining themselves. We are not overriding this proposition that occurred during the heyday of neoliberalism, which limits the amount you can raise taxes. So we just closed a primary school, right? In order to try to start balancing the budget.
What I'm getting at is there were two examples you gave. One of Gorbachev.
Yeah.
I couldn't agree more that he was quite a statesman and a courageous person, arising in the system that we've been criticizing, since 1918. And at the same time, there were people, say, like Nixon or whatever, in this wonderful democracy who morally did not come to
I see what you're
That's
saying.
what I'm getting
Yeah,
at.
I see what you're saying. Yeah.
Where
does it come? It's not all structural. You're right. I mean, we do make decisions, and there are individuals. I mean, my tendency is to resist a great man theory of history, which I know you're not presenting. But there is a certain amount of human agency in all of these things. And frankly, that's one of the good things about American political thought that has sustained us. That that is the idea that we are capable of a certain kind of inner transformation that we can have. Now we do it, right? But if we make that at the personal level something that's going to perhaps save our bacon at the national level at a certain point, that's not the way politics works. That's not the way the macro political economy operates. It's second row and then front row, in the back.
Sort
row.
of two-part question.
Yeah.
I believe I've read that incumbents in Congress, whether House or Senate, when they run for re-election, get re-elected about 95% of the time. And I wondered if you could comment about
that. Was true. That was true up till the 2008 election. Occasion, those sorts of things are always true when we're in a deadlock situation. But the truth of the matter is, one of the reasons for that is that there's been this great sorting out process that's occurred, in which the two parties have become identified as brands clearly enough, so that the redistricting in the different states has always been a battle of maximizing safe districts for your side. And allowing the other to have their districts on the other side. So that's one of the things that's going on. But go ahead. I'm sorry, I interrupted you.
The other thing I was going to ask you is, having spoken to some people who've actually run for Congress, they seem obsessed with raising money.
You have to be.
That is all it's that. And I just, in terms of your other comments,
one of the interesting things about running for Congress or running for the Senate. And it's one of the reasons why people retire, actually, from doing it. It requires at least an hour a day, every day. All the time. Maybe some weekends off. An hour a day, every day, has to be devoted to calling potential donors on the phone. and asking them for money. An hour a day. We're talking about someone who maybe was elected in November, right? Okay, on a Tuesday, on a Wednesday he's on the phone. There's no relief from it now, right? Okay. And one of the interesting things about the 2008 election, though, is the final collapse of the public financing of elections. But an interesting model that came into play, because the Obama fundraising juggernaut, up until he got the nomination, really was based on a very small donation. Now, after he got the nomination, the pigs came to feed at the trough again. But see, this is one of the real difficulties is, the Buckley decision of the Supreme Court years ago that equated spending money with free speech has been one of the key decisions in terms of constitutional history affecting representative government. Because basically, no matter how many constraints people have tried to put on money, the core of it doesn't go away. And money equals influence, right? That's what one political scientist named Thomas Ferguson called the golden rule, right, of politics, right? He who has the goal makes the rule. Right? And indeed, it is the case that there is not a president from 1900 up until now who has been elected who has not spent the most money. Now, some people say that's a reflection, the money's a reflection. Other people say, well, the money did it. Right? And sometimes it's been one or the other. But yeah, it's tough. Yes?
How do you think...
I'm sorry. He had a question, and then we'll get to it. No, there was another person who I acknowledged. Sorry. Yeah.
Mike, you mentioned Theodore Loewy as I guess you're a Loewy disciple. He wrote an interesting book in...
he's a very old friend now. So.
Okay. He wrote a book in the mid-'90s called, I think it was called American Liberalism, in which he argued that the American political parties had declined at the same rate at which special interest groups had gained in influence.
Yeah, this was actually, this was a new edition of an earlier book called The End of Liberalism.
Okay.
Yeah, and then he wrote a book called The End of the Republican Era, but he wrote it too soon because the first edition of that came out in 1991. Yeah. So,
my question for you is,
yeah.
Do you agree that the American political parties have lost clout over the last several decades to special interest groups and are no longer able to push through wholesale agendas? Platforms no longer mean anything of the Democratic Party or the Republican Party as they once did in American history.
Well, I think that there's been what could be called a transformation of the party system rather than a declining influence of parties. Because let's take a look at it from the Republican side during the George Bush years, the second George Bush, George Walker Bush. The K Street Project. Right? Anyone here know what the K Street Project was? Right. K Street Project. K Street Project was. It started out. Actually, it preceded the Republicans. Right. There was a guy named Tony Coelho. I don't know if anyone remembers him. He rose to be Tip O'Neill's majority whip in the Congress of the United States. He was the first one to recognize that there was a motherload of money that the Democratic Party could get from corporate donations. And they could be bundled, and despite limits, you could solicit it this way and that way. And then later on, the model was followed by the Republicans in turn, but they did it with an extra twist, which was to say, oh, God, why can't I remember the Hammer's real name? Tom DeLay. He gave it a new twist. He said, not only do you give us money, but you can't give the Democrats money. Right? Okay. So there tended to be a convergence in terms of the interest of party and the interest of particular corporate groups. So that the parties started to have a much more corporate character. The big loser in this, organized labor. Although organized labor has been trying to fight back, Notice what's not leading the agenda for the Obama administration, right? That secret ballot. Yeah. Yes, now you name it, and then I'll get to you. So.
I need some reassurance on this. How do you think Obama's doing with the environment?
The environment. How's Obama doing on the environment? I think he is thinking that it's a very, very important thing. I wish that they had established the knowledge standards a bit higher than they did, but they did do that. They are trying to get back in negotiations in terms of international agreements on carbon dioxide. And they have an EPA that has scientists in it again. I'm sorry. I'm sorry. My Republican friends out there, you better start yelling at me or I'll just get worse. There's this sort of thing, right? If you poke a sharp stick in your eye, right, and it hurts and it hurts and it hurts, and then you pull it out halfway, it feels a little bit better, right? Now the question is whether, just by not being Bush, the Obama administration is doing a better job in terms of environmental policy. I don't know how far they've gone or how far they will be going in terms of that. I think Salazar's been a better Secretary of the Interior than we thought, first of all. We have a great new Secretary of Energy. No, you don't agree? Better than we expected, right? Maybe. Not the best choice, right? But overall, I think the jury's out. The pressure concerning the declined economy to relax standards in terms of meeting the early goals for the environmental side of things is going to be tough. And indeed, who is it in Utah right now? It's been putting a hold on different people until Salazar will look at mining leases again. So it's politics. Yes, sir.
You said that Obama has the potential for being as truthful about the American empire as Mikhail Gorbachev was truthful about the Soviet empire.
Yeah.
If Obama succeeds in his truthfulness, which could bring about the downfall of the American empire.
Yeah.
Will our empire be succeeded by a Chinese empire?
Probably.
A Muslim empire?
Probably, yeah. Yeah. Probably, I'd say Chinese empire. Chinese are ascendant right now in terms of those rules of history. They own so much of our debt now that they can have an influence on.
I'll be better off with an American empire or the Chinese empire?
It's a funny business because to be better off with empire, I myself, whenever I was growing up, I was taught that we were a democratic republic and that we weren't an empire. Now, I sit here among some very powerful people I know, Amherst College alums, who have in many ways been managers of our country for a long period of time, and I know that's still sort of in some ways. How shall I put it? A naive view. But the question is, are we better? To say that we're better off with an empire is an incredibly complicated question. One, it has pragmatic elements to it. That is our standard of living going to be better if we remain an empire? Probably won't. Right? It also has what could be called moral ethical implications. Empires usually do not treat those who are their subjects well. And we haven't either.
Now let me provoke you once more.
Yeah.
As human beings, we've always been at war with each other for the Earth's limited resources.
Yes.
All right? And the fall of our empire will affect our human resources. Mm-hmm. Because as human beings, we've always been greedy, and we've always been at war with each other. And if Obama is truthful, all right, we're going to have... That's
part of the truth, too.
Yeah. If he's truthful, it's going to affect our standard of living.
Yeah.
And it's going to affect the amount of power we have.
Well, here's what my question and my response to that is to say, passe, the neoconservative attempt to have a new American century, right, which indeed had to do with expanding empire. We don't have the resources to do it. So in a certain sense, your question is premised on the idea that somehow we can choose whether we're going to continue to be an empire or not. What I'm trying to say is that we're losing it. And what we need to have is a softer landing than we will have if we do not face up to the realities of how we're losing it. Right? So for me, that's a different question. Now, some might say we could sustain it. After all, we spend more in terms of one measure of international power, that is military, than the rest of the world combined. The rest of the world combined. There's the United States, and then there's the rest of the world, and we spend more money on the military than the rest of the world combined. That's still true. Right? But we have had other costs as well. Right? We've had enormous domestic costs that are never discussed. Right? One of the largest of our domestic costs has been the establishment of what could be called a carceral nation. What? We've dealt with our problem of massive unemployment by throwing millions of people into prison. Millions. We have 3 million people in prison in the United States. That's the largest prison population per capita and also grossly in the world. Now, it's not simply because all of a sudden we have a lot more bad people than we did back in 1970. Right? Okay. So there are all these sorts of things going on. So where are we?
We're at 2:30. Maybe one more question.
One more question. You've had your hand up for a while.
You're talking. You mentioned about campaign contributions and what it takes to get elected, and that's virtually all because of the need to advertise on television.
Yeah.
While journalistic standards have dropped in terms of what it takes to source a story to get it out there.
Yeah.
At the same time, in the name of fairness, but I think actually in the name of entertainment, television news gives equal time to everyone. Mm-hmm. In order to create good TV, they like to...
Actually, they give equal time in terms of different networks.
Well, but even on a network, if you want to go out there and say, talk about carrying guns in Yellowstone National Park, if they're going to debate that, even on Fox News, or whether it's Fox News or
they'll have somebody.
They'll have somebody on the other side who over time gives the appearance that that opinion is held by 50% of the people.
Right. Fair amounts.
Entertainment, news as entertainment, I think, is one of the things that's crippling the nation. And I wonder what you feel about that.
Oh, actually, I couldn't agree with you more.
As a gunfight, and they're trying to get people to yell at each other and disagree.
Yeah.
But someone with
television has a lot to answer. We're talking with one of our distinguished alumnus in the entertainment industry. But here's the thing about it. There's been this strange sorting out because, as we all know, even in terms of the networks that once predominated are pretty much gone. In terms of, well, they're not pretty much gone, they're in decline, kind of a permanent decline. We've had the rise of these...
But they own the subsidiaries.
They own the subsidiaries, right?
CNBC,
MSNBC, and News Corporation owns Fox, and CNN's owned by Time Warner, right? Yeah. So we have these huge, and of course the NBC is owned by General Electric. So we have these huge news networks that run 24 hours a day. And part of what they have to do is they have to fill them off with time, right? So they become this kind of, they have to generate, in order to get eyes on too, they have to generate controversy, right? Because who's going to, let's look at the ratings, okay? We will have a markup hearing on C-SPAN. Right? Again, something that Amherst College is responsible for. I don't know if you know that. Well, not the college itself, but one of our alums. There's going to be a markup session on C-SPAN, or you can watch Barney Frank, being talked to, screamed at by O'Reilly on the O'Reilly Factor. Now, what are you going to watch, right? Okay. I mean,
But doesn't that slow government down?
It does. Yeah. Yeah, the false appearance of there being two sides to every story is a pernicious thing, and it's stupid. And that's part of the pernicious character of it. But it also has resulted in all this other mess. Well, look, our time is up. Enjoy your weekend. We'll see y'all later.